Hello and welcome to Coffee and Conversation. I'm your host, Shashank Bengali. I'm here with Katiza Rodriguez. She's the International Rights Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit that defends civil liberties in the digital world. Katiza, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
You guys work very closely on digital rights around the world. What has the pandemic meant for the work that you do? How has it affected advocacy for digital privacy rights?
We cannot do our normal work of advocacy by meeting people and explaining the issues, but now we have to do everything online. A main issue during this time is that privacy has become more relevant than ever, especially also security. Be able to communicate all our issues, our strategies, policy proposals with other policymakers or other stakeholders, and sometimes we need private communication, so security has become more relevant than ever.
So how have governments and companies used the crisis to introduce new anti-privacy legislation, new anti-privacy measures? We've seen such a focus on contact tracing and apps to track people who have COVID-19 infections. How have these efforts been a way to slip in some anti-privacy measures that weren't there before?
There have been many proposals to try to contain the virus, either for social distancing or enforcement of quarantine. But some of those proposals are actually not really trying to solve the problem. And we have seen a lot of opportunity for government to pass this surveillance agenda that have always wanted to implement, but haven't been possible before. So we have seen the use of facial recognition to try to contain this virus, or use of location tracking, massive surveillance, the collection of everyone's data in order to try to contain the virus. But those proposals are actually, there are little evidence about how they will solve the problem, and they have been the dream policy agenda of these policymakers for years.
Yeah, we've seen this kind of trend of the last several years of more and more legislation to control digital speech. We've seen that only seem to accelerate while people are focused on the pandemic. We've seen a number of countries push ahead with or introduce even new anti-privacy, anti-speech laws to control online discourse. Just today, as we were preparing for this interview, there was a fake news bill passed in Brazil, for example, that has a very broad, some would say overbroad restrictions on speech. Can you talk a bit about this fake news bill in Brazil?
It's a law that supposedly tries to curb fake news, but in reality is imposing a lot of draconian measures that try to affect the privacy of millions of Brazilians in order to try to catch a few people, a few malicious people. One of the provisions is seeking to force companies like WhatsApp or iMessage to redesign their privacy by design software in order to allow them to retain all the messages that have been forwarded more than 5 times to at least 1,000 people. This will impose a huge amount of data retention obligation of all these forwarded messages for a period of 3 months.
Certainly the trend in a lot of these developing countries, not just Brazil, but of course across Asia, we're seeing governments try to implement criminal libel bills and all kinds of laws that would police online speech. We just saw the case recently of the Philippine-American journalist Maria Ressa, who was convicted of libel, her publishing an article that violated a law that didn't exist when the article was published originally. But because the news website Rappler fixed a typographical error in the original story, it was seen to have been republished. And therefore, the article then, after it was republished online, came into the scope of the law. So this is one example of how it seems like governments are able to really take extreme steps, and the digital publication is coming under a lot more scrutiny. It's not like the old days where you had a newspaper article published one time. Now you constantly have websites being updated, continuous news being published online. How do these laws really police online speech and the work of online news platforms, particularly when there's a pandemic and governments are trying to control the flow of information?
Yeah, well, criminal defamation is a very serious threat to free expression. Many United Nations special rapporteurs on freedom of expression have called for the decriminalization of defamation laws. These laws exist in many developing countries, not only in the Philippines, but also in Brazil and in Peru, for example. They have been used, and that's what many UN special rapporteurs have also said, to silence speech having abused by political figures or by governments. And so they are a problem. The provision to be able to identify and retain the data of who sent a message to whom, it will be used for criminal prosecution of cases like defamation, label, slander.
We've talked about Brazil, the Philippines. It's hard not to talk about data collection and digital surveillance without talking about China. And the other major issue in the news these days beyond the pandemic is China's introduction of a new national security law in Hong Kong, which basically extends Chinese data collection and Chinese surveillance laws across the territory of Hong Kong. Can you talk a little bit about what this means for Hong Kong and what you think those of us concerned about privacy should be worried about when they see China expanding its efforts to a very important global city like Hong Kong?
Yeah, China has been championing surveillance measures that are very disproportionate, especially the use of their facial recognition to track people who are like passing through CCTV cameras and trying to identify them. This technology it's a mass surveillance technology that in many cities in the United States have been banned. And so I see it very problematic, especially with the new security law that have been approved that is that have imposed very serious penalties, even for people who are they call terrorism, but sometimes the concept of terrorism is very bad interpreted in countries like in Latin America, and I think also in some Asian countries, to mean sometimes what protesters does. So yeah, the data collection practices allow law enforcement to be able to identify who are the protesters who have been in certain areas. Obviously, it can be used also to prosecute legitimate crimes. The problem is about not the surveillance. Accessing data for law enforcement purposes is not bad per se, but accessing data for law enforcement in a disproportionate way or in ways that is unnecessary, it's really concerning. It can be abused to track the people, to silence dissent, to silence those who are criticizing the government.
Katiza, thank you so much for joining us. That's all the time we have for today here on Coffee and Conversation. I'm your host, Shashank Bengali. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.